From the Smith government's push to a hybrid healthcare system to the ever-expanding list of recall petitions and the pending Alberta-Ottawa MOU. Time now for tonight's politics panel, and joining us this evening, former MLA Karen McPherson, and John Brennan is a political analyst and commentator. Good evening to you both, and let's begin with the introduction of legislation setting out increased private health delivery.
What's changing here is the flexibility to toggle between public and private on a case-by-case and patient-by-patient basis.
People who can afford to pay will certainly see their wait times go down, but the rest of us will see our wait times go up unless there's way more doctors, way more anesthetists, way more nurses, way more people doing the surgeries.
Some of the political dialogue playing out now that the province is detailing some of how it will roll out a dual practice model, allowing some doctors to provide both public and private care, a system the government says will cut down on surgery wait times and give Albertans more options. Karen, how significant a turning point do you consider this legislation to be in the history of Alberta's healthcare system?
It's very significant. It's significant in Canada, and it's really caused a lot of concern from many different camps, including healthcare professionals who have voiced concerns about whether or not this adheres to the Canada Health Act. This is a big difference. It's been compared by the government to what happens in Europe and Japan. What isn't the same is how we handle taxation. And it's really an apples and oranges comparison. And I think the overall concern is that this introduces a U.S. style of insurance where insurance companies make healthcare decisions rather than public healthcare that we're used to and that we really value in our country.
John, is there the degree of change here that would have warranted campaigning on it in the last provincial election?
Absolutely, Michael. Just like it would have been good for Danielle Smith to campaign and all the things she's trying to do under the Alberta Next panel, which she also didn't campaign on. But, I agree with what a lot of Karen just said there. Obviously, this is going to create a two-tiered system, just by definition. People who have the means will be able to pay to have surgery done and have reduced wait times, and people that don't will have to wait for the care in the public healthcare system. So it'll be very interesting to me, Michael, whether or not this is challenged, and it may well be, and if it contravenes the Canada Health Act, because it's pretty clear to me that under the Canada Health Act, you can't charge people for medically necessary procedures. And so this is going to be really tricky for the government to get through and to implement once it comes through with the ministerial orders and the regulations.
Karen, Albertans have pushed back on healthcare privatization in a big way in the past. Is there now more of an appetite for change?
I think there's more demand for the public healthcare system to deliver what people need. And we haven't seen that. We still have exceedingly long wait times, longer than many other jurisdictions. I was taking a look at what the UK is like in their public healthcare system, and their public delivery is better than ours. I think the appetite is for strategic investment in public healthcare rather than privatizing and making parts of healthcare inaccessible to a lot of people that just can't afford it.
John, to what degree do you see this legislation being heralded at this weekend's UCP AGM?
Well, it will probably be warmly received because, there is a constituency in this province that supports additional privatization of our healthcare system. And Karen just touched on there with a long waiting list. We have long waiting lists in this province, as we do across the country, for orthopedic surgeries, especially for things like knee replacements and hip replacements. And so if you're a person who has a really sore knee or a really sore hip, and you're on a waiting list to get a replacement, and if you have the financial means, then all of a sudden you're able to actually have that surgery done in a month or so, if you're willing to pay for it, a lot of people are going to choose to do that, Michael. But as I said in my last answer, this is going to create a two-tier healthcare system in Alberta where those that have the ability of pay will get better service, and those that don't will have to wait for the public healthcare system. And my last point on this, Michael, has always been the concern with this issue has been that if you privatize more of the healthcare system, the best and the brightest, the best doctors and the best nurses, the best anesthesiologists are going to gravitate to the private system and away from the public system. So that's something the UCP government is really going to have to watch, Michael.
All right, next up, Elections Alberta revealing today that 5 more recall petitions have been approved, part of an ever-growing list that includes the Minister of Service Alberta and Red Tape Reduction, who is questioning the credibility of those behind the efforts.
This is clearly a case of a left-wing activist group, Alberta Resistance, that is using recall, that is weaponizing it to force a general election.
When I first filed, and I think Dale had a response that this was a well-funded, well-organized organization, and my wife kind of cracked a joke. She's like, "You're not well-organized or well-funded." So
recall petitions have now been issued for 14 UCP MLAs, adding to that list of 9 you see there. Organizers have 90 days to collect signatures amounting to 60% of votes in the constituency in the last provincial election. Many of the politicians targeted call it an abuse of the legislation. John, how do you see the Premier addressing this issue at the AGM?
This one's going to be a little tougher, Michael, but I wouldn't be surprised if before this session of the Legislative Assembly is done, they might amend the legislation, although I don't think they can do that retroactively. You know, look, it was the UCP that created this recall legislation and the citizenship initiative legislation, so they've got to live by it. And now, because there is obviously there's some unhappiness out in Alberta with some UCP MLAs, so they're now being targeted with this recall legislation. But we have to also point out, Michael, that it is going to be tough for the people who are organizing these campaigns to take out these MLAs. Because as you just said in your introduction, they have to get 60% of the voters who vote, or the people who voted in the last election. And then if they are able to do that, and that's verified by Elections Alberta, then they have to have a recall election where more than 50% of people have to vote for a recall. And if that happens, then there's a by-election. So there's a lot of steps to this before anybody is going to be recalled in this province.
Karen, to John's early point there have been suggestions of the Premier considering changes to the Recall Act. How would that play as this list of recall petitions continues to grow?
I think it would come across as disingenuous. The government created the opportunity for direct democracy, and it's really activated a lot of people. And it's going to be hard to close the barn door. The horses are bolting, and people see a way to be able to make their feelings known now, not 2 years from now when we're expecting the next election. John is right. Not all of these petitions are going to be successful. The recall will not be successful for all 14 of those MLAs, which represents, half the cabinet. If we're looking for numbers, there's 29 in cabinet, 27 ministers and 2 junior ministers. So 14 out of the caucus, that's a big number. I think it really demonstrates how upset and unheard many people feel. I said that last time we were here, that we were going to see more. I didn't expect this many. It's a lot. It's hard to keep up.
Well, and maybe as a final thought, John, could this push the Smith government all the way to calling an early election?
Possibly, Michael, because they don't want this recall campaign to get out of hand. But of course, they, as I said earlier, they created this recall legislation and they didn't put any guardrails around how people could use it. And so now disenchanted Albertans are using the legislation they put in place to try to attempt to recall UCP MLAs. I think a lot of things would factor into whether or not there'd be an early election, Michael. Part of it will be how successful this new MOU is going to be with the Government of Canada, and also the state of our healthcare system. Because at the end of the day, it's healthcare and education are the 2 most important services that every provincial government provides, and it's how they're doing in those fields that they'll be judged by Albertans.
All right, time for us to take a bit of a break, but when we come back, all eyes on Calgary and the countdown to an Alberta-Ottawa MOU. More from our politics panel in a moment. Welcome back. The Prime Minister is slated to address the Calgary Chamber of Commerce Thursday. The same day, a formalized announcement is expected in Calgary on a memorandum of understanding between the Alberta and federal governments, one supposedly paving the way to a new oil pipeline to the West coast. Karen, how politically calculated a move is this from the Carney government standpoint?
It certainly shows a difference from the Trudeau government. This is a much different level of engagement, much different attitude of taking concerns they're hearing from Alberta seriously and addressing them, bringing some solutions to the table where what we had seen previously was not solution-based at all. It was two governments using each other as fodder for their political purposes.
John, what's riding on this from Premier Smith's standpoint?
Well, she's certainly hopeful that she's going to get a great agreement with Mark Carney and the government of Canada that will allow for the development of another bitumen pipeline from Alberta to the northwest coast of BC. And, you know, she's going to have to make some concessions to Carney to make this happen. Amongst them, and I've mentioned this before when we talked about this, Michael, she's going to have to increase the industrial carbon tax on large emitters in Alberta. You might remember, Michael, that earlier this year, Danielle Smith and Rebecca Schultz announced a freeze on the current industrial carbon tax. I believe it was at $95 a ton at the time. So that's going to have to increase to act as an incentive for the Pathways Alliance project. And this is obviously key for Mark Carney. He wants to see the Pathways Alliance project built. That's that proposed $16 billion pipeline project, Michael, to take carbon dioxide from the oil sands up in Fort McMurray down to the Cold Lake area and pump that CO2 deep into caverns underground. And so that's sort of the quid pro quo that Mark Carney's looking for Danielle Smith. But if Danielle Smith gets this pipeline project, Michael, it'll be a huge boon for Alberta and by extension for Canada.
Karen, from a timing perspective, how much of a win do you see this potentially being for Danielle Smith heading into the weekend, the UCP AGM?
I think mostly it's a win. I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword as well, depending on how much she's relying on Alberta separatists to prop up her power within the UCP. Separatists aren't going to be really happy about an Alberta government signing an agreement with the federal government. I mean, that's a signal of the opposite of any kind of separatist overture. So by and large, very good. She's going to be able to toot her own horn about this agreement. I think it's a win for her. And it also comes with some drawbacks. I'm sure she's measured, you know, the plus minus for that, and she's going to come out ahead. But I think it's still something to keep an eye on. John,
you talked about concessions a moment ago. How much give and take do you expect to actually be at play here? And is success contingent on give and take?
Absolutely, Michael. As Danielle Smith had said at the federal provincial ministers meeting with the Prime Minister earlier this year, this is a grand bargain for the government of Canada to put its weight behind building this new pipeline to northwest BC. She has to give some concessions, and that is on the industrial carbon tax. That's to make sure that the Pathways Alliance project gets built. And as I said the last time we talked about this project, Michael, it'll still have to go through a thorough environmental assessment process. There's going to have to be an intensive consultation with Indigenous communities along the route, and the government of British Columbia is going to have to be engaged on this project. But you know, this project, Michael, has the potential to be hugely beneficial, not just for Alberta, but for all of Canada. You know, Heather Ekstrom-Poirot, the expert in natural resources for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, estimated that a new $1 million a day pipeline from Alberta to BC would generate $80 billion addition to Canada's GDP once it's built, just like the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion has done. So it has a huge potential to be very beneficial for both Alberta and for all of Canada, Michael.
Karen, the UB government continues to push back this week in a very big way. How do you expect to see BC being reflected in an Alberta-Ottawa agreement?
Well, it's not reflected right now, as far as we can tell from what's been said so far. And EB makes some good points. It's kind of like, hey, guys, what about us? We have something to say about this, as well as the coastal First Nations, who have been very clear that tankers along the coast are not something that they would be willing to budge on at all, as well as pipelines to the area. It's going to take some adeptness to bring EB and BC on board and to be able to negotiate with the coastal First Nations and other First Nations that will be impacted by a potential pipeline. There's not even a sponsor yet.
John, we've touched on at a number of points this evening about the UCP AGM this weekend. If you bring that full circle, what's ultimately riding on this agreement where national unity is concerned?
It's huge, Michael. I think if this project goes ahead, it's going to undercut the separatist movement in Alberta. Because you know what, Michael? It shows that Canada works. It shows that the Prime Minister of Canada can work with the Premier of Alberta to get a project done that benefits all of Alberta and all of Canada. So that undercuts the separatist argument. And it does what Mark Carney wants to do, and that is to build the Canadian economy so that we're not so weak in comparison to the United States, and to expand our customer base so we're not so dependent on the United States for our exports. And, you know, we've seen with the how well the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion project has done, Michael. It is generating billions in revenue for the government of Alberta and billions of profits and revenue for the government of Canada. And this project would as well. And by diversifying our exports to Asia, where there is a ready market for oil and natural gas, it lessens our dependence on the United States, Michael. So it's a win-win, both for Danielle Smith and for Mark Carney.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Great to see you both. Thank you for this.
Thanks, Michael.
Good night.